that this role has become one of the most powerful posts in the Westminster foreign policy ecosystem, a really important instrument of holding the government to account and scrutinizing its work. Alicia has already established herself as a very powerful voice on a range of issues: China, the war in Ukraine, European regional security. We're really delighted to have her here with us today, talking a little bit more about the priorities for the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, some of the big issues of the day, and where she'd like to see government shifting tack or going harder or further or taking a different approach. Alicia will speak, and then we'll have a little conversation. We'll go to the room for Q&A. We'll also be going online for Q&A, so for all our audience at home, please feel free also to put up your hand. You can come in with questions later. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Alicia.
Well, thank you all ever so much for having me today. So over the last 2 decades, we have focused on the threats from terrorists who behave like states. And whilst these presented the most immediate threat, we failed to recognise a far greater challenge, and that's states who behave like terrorists and the rise of autocratic assertiveness. In Ukraine, we see the cost of this complacency. And instead of celebrating that Ukraine is still standing 1 year on, we should be asking why we didn't act when Putin invaded Crimea in 2014. Why again democratic allies stood lame while Putin pushed into Syria just a year later. And why last year, even then, we chose to believe the hollow words of an autocrat. In Kyiv last week, I thanked our Ukrainian allies for fighting for our freedoms. And we have to recommit to fight just as hard for them as they are fighting for us. Because whilst Putin's immediate aims may have been thwarted, his actions are representative of a wider struggle between autocracies and democracies. As most autocrats do, Putin told us what his ambitions were. But our convictions in the strength of market capitalism, democratic governance, and the values of the international rules-based system were too great. Optimism and the belief in the inherent appeal of Western order, norms, and values blinded us. It blinded us from recognising that they are not enough to deter autocrats on their own. Indeed, it's only in the last 2 years that we've admitted that our efforts to court China's leaders failed. My criticism of the so-called golden era is not so much that we held hope, it's that we failed to plan for what would happen if our hope was misplaced. It was a noble idea that open arms would nudge autocratic states onto a different path. But by believing this without contingency, we failed to understand that the assault on the international rules-based order is not a matter of tactical advantage, but strategic intent, and that naivety has left us vulnerable. Now, this contest between autocracies and those abiding by the rule-based system will define the next few decades of our lives. And therefore, it's critical that we put ourselves in the strongest possible position to face those threats. Now, we're all familiar with the playbook of autocrats: the nuclear posturing, the ruthless repression of their own people, helping criminals to circumvent sanctions, private militaries, and the funding of instability around the world. But authoritarian attempts to sow weakness into the foundations of our society are slow, methodical, and often difficult to detect. Now, to my mind, we face 3 creeping threats that risk undermining our security. The first is transnational repression. When autocratic regimes feel threatened, they silence dissent far beyond their own borders. We know that Putin doesn't hesitate to hunt down his own political enemies on our shores, as seen with the murder of Alexander Litvinenko and the attempted murder of the Skripals. Iranian journalists have been forced to flee the UK, terrorised for upholding their duty to give a voice to those who Tehran seeks to silence. And the IRGC has attempted to kidnap or kill at least 15 people in the UK. And yet, we allow their recruitment centres in Maida Vale, Wilton and Manchester to continue to operate. These must be closed. Meanwhile, Chinese diplomats brutalised Hong Konger Bob Chan in Manchester for daring to protest peacefully outside the Chinese consulate. And the Chinese Communist Party has illegal police stations operating here on our shores, where silence is bought with the threat of violence enacted against loved ones back in China. Now, when we fail to expel those responsible, or even declare them persona non grata, we demonstrate to the Chinese Communist Party that our resolve is not absolute, and we show weakness. We cannot delude ourselves into thinking that rhetoric alone will send a clear message to Xi Jinping. If we are unwilling to defend human rights on our own soil, then how can we uphold them on the world stage? For our own sake, and for the sake of our global standing, we must address transnational repression. The second threat we face is techno-authoritarianism and resource weaponization. And by this I mean that autocrats are engineering strategic reliance on their regimes for technologies and critical resources. We are already dangerously dependent on China for critical components. From the tiniest chips found in mobile phones to the sensitive technologies that power our cars, our wind turbines and our satellites. But the longer we delay in phasing out these dual-use and sensitive Chinese state technologies, the more entrenched malign supplies become and the more expensive the extraction. And let's be clear, inaction is a choice. And the cost of that inaction will be far greater than acting now. Over the last year, we've seen Germany and other nations learn that reliance on autocratic state for resources can and will be weaponized. Today, it may be Putin's gas, but tomorrow? But this is more about just tech and physical resources. To build its tech totalitarian state, the Chinese Communist Party is industrializing the discrete and overt acquisition of all our data. We spent weeks talking about balloons in our stratosphere, when actually the much greater threat lies in our pockets and on our streets. Data exploiting technologies have become part of the fabric of our lives, whether it be TikTok or Hikvision and Dahua CCTV cameras on our streets, or the DJI drones and high-terror body cameras carried by our police. Our data makes us vulnerable. It reveals our networks, our locations, our interests, our habits, and our pattern of life. And as other countries take action to protect their citizens, we run the risk of becoming a laggard amongst free and law-abiding nations. Because as we stand, we are allowing, it is a choice, to allow autocrats to acquire our data. So I hope in 2023 we finally take action against the techno-authoritarianism of our strategic competitors. The third challenge we need to address is the subversion of multilateral organisations to undermine the international rules-based system. These organisations were never envisioned as a battleground for competing political ideologies, yet this is what they have become. Take Interpol. For years, autocratic-backed candidates have been placed into leadership positions. And what's the result? Red arrest notices for dissidents, political activists, and even refugees. We've seen the same at the UN, where autocracies infiltrate its bureaucracies in order to shape communiques and water down criticism of human rights abuses. In multilateral organisations, we have made the choice to cede ground instead of standing firm for the principles on which they were founded. And this isn't some question of abstract geopolitical norms. It's about the fundamental safety of our citizens and the consequences of allowing autocrats to neuter the arbiters of human rights. Multilaterals were created to protect us all, and we cannot allow them to become yet another vehicle for autocratic tyranny. And that is why my committee undertook an inquiry into how we uphold and protect the multilateral system. To protect ourselves and defend our way of life is vital, but to do that we have to challenge autocrats from a place of strength. We can't stop these threats at source. It is unrealistic, despite what you might hear from some in the Commons, to simply end relations with any country that does not share our values. But we can take action to defend ourselves. And what this takes is for our foremost priority of the next 2 decades to be building whole-of-state resilience. We need to draw on the ingenuity of the private sector, the resources of the state, and the autonomy of the individual. And we need to make ourselves resilient so that whenever and wherever we engage with the autocrats, we do so from a position of strength and not vulnerability, because this isn't simple. Autocrats are so quick to point to defence and claim aggression. It is a trick to deflect, divide and deter us. Defence is never and is not an escalation, but the foundation of our future strength. And the basis of our defence lies in our ability to become resilient. Now, resilience has become a buzzword, so let me be explicit about exactly what I'm calling for. We must recognise that attacks will target every aspect of our societies, and increasingly this will come in the form of technologies, cutouts, dependencies and data mining. Combating them isn't glamorous. It isn't going to win the government's sexy headlines, but the days of James Bond are truly over. It is now the turn of the data scientist, the rare minerals expert and the deterrence diplomat to keep us safe. And resilience is a multi-decade endeavour. So how do we begin to protect ourselves? Firstly, resilience requires us to take a stand and compete within multilateral institutions. Instead of ceding ground, we must fight for our values, advance our own candidates, and recognise that allyship is hard-won and cannot be taken for granted. The international rules-based system is built and rebuilt on the actions of our members. So now is the time for us to become more active as we secure our place in the world. Next, we must set serious ambitions for the development of the technologies of the future, because emerging technologies will determine our strategic edge. The autocrats have recognised that. Now it's time for us to do so. Think AI, quantum, biotech. Building competitive advantage in these fields is vital for our prosperity and our security. And we are in a new race for science and technological advancement, so we have to recommit to being a scientific superpower. Now, the Prime Minister has taken the right first step to do that with his reorganisation of departments, but what's missing as yet is some realism in our strategy towards the industries of the future. In critical areas, yes, the UK needs sovereign capabilities, but resilience does not mean onshoring every capability nor competing in all domains. We simply cannot go it alone when it comes to constraining rogue actors. But instead, we should identify our strengths and weaknesses and work with those aligned to our values to develop technology partnerships. And the next step is rejoining the EU's Horizon programme and working with like-minded countries. From Tallinn to Tokyo, the foundations of a new scientific coalition exist. We just need to commit. Then domestically, we need to be honest with the public about the short-term trade-offs that are making us more resilient will entail. Because being resilient will require us to take tough economic decisions for the sake of our security. Our critical infrastructure must be protected from dangerous forms of investment, and we have to wean ourselves off a cheap diet of subsidised tech. It is the government, however, who needs to be brave enough to say this explicitly. And we can no longer see industrial strategy as a dirty term. We need to ensure that our supply chains are robust and that we don't further delay delivery on key promised strategies. The semiconductor strategy, the critical minerals review, these are vital for laying out a roadmap to future economic prosperity and resilience, and they can't come soon enough. That's why my committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, has launched an inquiry into examining the UK's access to critical minerals markets and supply chains. And this inquiry is a perfect example of where a material critical to sensitive security components, and therefore our prosperity, is in plentiful supplies, but geopolitical decisions are putting key resources at risk. The government must then make national security a priority across all areas of decision making. National security assessments should be mandatory in all legislation, not just those areas seen as securitized. And that is why I amended the Higher Education Bill to protect us from Chinese hostile state cutouts on our university campuses. The upcoming procurement bill is an opportunity to protect us from aligned companies in our supply chains. It is hard to overstate just how infiltrated we have become. Even in Parliament, the birthplace of democracy, we have seen the malign influence of autocratic states through useful idiots and cyber attacks. Any meaningful effort to introduce resilience must deliver concrete policy change. I'm tired of the performative rhetoric, get on and make our people safer, because we have wasted too much time debating whether or not China is a threat, instead of taking the actions we need to make ourselves safe. The integrated review refresh must outline how the government will meaningfully protect us. And finally, resilience is about much more than government and business. We're living through the democratisation of information. How information is created, accessed and shared is rapidly changing. And across the world, individuals have more or less embraced this new power as arbiters of truth and information. But they haven't yet harnessed this opportunity to step forward and protect our communities. Now, this comes from the issue that for too long the government has infantilised the public on the issue of national security. We have shut the public out of conversations, and citizens have been effectively encouraged to abdicate responsibility for their own security. It doesn't have to be this way. Our forebears recognised the role of collective responsibility in protecting individual freedoms. We must take responsibility again and ask not what our country can do for us, but instead recognise our collective duty to make the choices that make our country safer. Collective resilience can halt the encroachment of autocrats and re-establish national security. But we need to start a national conversation about personal responsibility and the everyday choices that each of us can make to hold off the autocrats. In conclusion, in its upcoming refresh of the integrated review, the government must prove that it has learnt the lessons of the last decade. The route to safety lies in resilience, and resilience must be the beating heart of the integrated review when it is refreshed. And my committee will be watching to make sure the government understands this, because national security cannot be an afterthought, and we must not apologise for making our nation more resilient to those who seek to undermine us. We must never allow defence to be misrepresented as escalation, and we cannot risk hesitation if we are to outpace the autocrats. Because without national security, there is no economic security, and the sooner the government recognises that, the better. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and you covered a lot of ground there. I'd like to just start with China, because this has obviously been an issue you've been very outspoken about, not only in your role as the chair of the FAC, but also in the China research groups and other interventions you've made. Do you think it is possible for the UK to get to a point where we can engage? You mentioned some of the sort of tools, policies, instruments to help us get there. But also, what are some of the big kind of institutional, cultural shifts that we need to go on? You know, those journeys that government needs to have in order that we can get to that place.
So I don't think it's a choice. We can't decide whether or not we're going to deal with China from a position of strength. And we also can't decide whether or not we're going to have dialogue with China. China is one of our biggest trading partners. We are dangerously reliant on them presently. And the reality is that China has a voice in the world, and it has a role to play in the Indo-Pacific and where it wants to protect its own people. The problem is, though, is that we went through this golden era where we didn't set any red lines. We opened every single door, and we genuinely thought that it would be enough, this open door policy, to bring them to us. And it wasn't. We know the Chinese respond to strength. We know that they compartmentalise the different discussions they have, but we haven't mapped that. And yet, if you were working in business, if you're working in diplomacy, your foremost goal is to understand how the person you're engaging with thinks. What historical context do you need to give to the conversation? How do you need to approach it? Can they compartmentalise? Do they not? Where do they respond to strength? Where do they not? We haven't done that. And there is a major problem in the UK that we do not have the China capabilities we need. And I think this is something sometimes people struggle to understand, is that you can believe we need to be strong about China, but also believe that we need to massively improve our understanding and knowledge of China and our engagement with China on certain aspects. So I think we can. And I think that shift in government has definitely taken place. It's been led by Parliament, but from Huawei onwards, you saw a change in the conversation. But without the pandemic, I still fear we wouldn't be where we need to be on the discussion about China. So unfortunately, the very worst opened our eyes, as it often does. But it has changed the entire tenor of the discussion. The problem is that even within Parliament, not just within government, we tend to rhetoric when we should focus on solutions and pragmatics and how we move forward. And so that for us has to be the priority, is making sure that we don't use rhetoric that unnecessarily isolates us or pushes China or aggravates, because you're achieving nothing for having used that language, but actually that we focus on what meaningfully will protect us. And that comes back to the core of my speech, which is defence cannot be seen as an escalation. When you look at autocrats around the world, that is the narrative they push. Putin claims that NATO, a defensive organisation, is an aggressive one. He claims that Ukraine defending itself is an aggressive move. If you look at what's happening in Serbia, the same sort of arguments where Serbia tries to claim that peaceful democratic countries around it are being aggressive when they just simply want to defend themselves. We cannot allow us to fall into the same trap when we have a duty to protect ourselves, but also to uphold the international rules-based system, because that is what people look to the UK to do. So if we're not strong on UK soil, we cannot be relied on internationally, and so we send the wrong messages to our allies who are looking for us to stand strong.
You mentioned Ukraine there. You have obviously been out to Ukraine. You have very much focused on that as part of your work as chair of the FAC. It's clearly an area of significant personal as well as professional interest for you. How are you feeling as we go into the second year of the conflict there? Are you optimistic that the tide can be turned this year, or are you anticipating a longer, more protracted conflict?
So I think there's no question we've reached a very difficult point. And as I alluded to in my speech, I really struggled with the so-called anniversary of this conflict. because we should never have got there in the first place. The UK and the US went around and told Western allies that Ukraine was going to be invaded. When I was in Ukraine last year, I think 4 weeks before the renewed illegal invasion, I was given that briefing. And we were told that Putin was going to go straight for Kyiv, he was going to try and decapitate the country, and we were told there were going to be problems with his supply chains. And yet, Western allies, blinded by complacency and arrogance, told us that we were wrong, told us that there was no renewed illegal invasion that was going to take place. So I find it very difficult to then go to places like the Munich Security Conference, where Western leaders are patting themselves on the back and saying, isn't it amazing that Ukraine is still standing? Aren't they brave? Yes, they are brave. But they are fighting for us and they shouldn't be having to fight at this moment. And that's where really that idea about defence never being escalation has come from. Because what we learned from Ukraine is that yes, defence is never an escalation. 2, counterattack has to be swift. Now when I say counterattack, I don't mean invading other countries, but I mean responding with the tools that you need to protect yourself. We have to act quicker. And this point about allyship being hard won and that you have to protect it, because we see all these discussions that went about the global south versus the global north, people not wanting to pick. I recognise why governments say we can't force countries to decide. But as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think we do have to push back on that narrative. You don't get the liberty of saying, I'm not going to pick a side between the rules-based order and national sovereignty and not. Autocrats who think they can invade, autocrats who attack, autocrats who threaten. You do have to pick a side. So I think it's very difficult, and I do feel very strongly about it because in the darkest of times, Ukrainian MPs have become my true friends. And the only blessing from our visit was that the 24 hours we were in Kyiv, Putin felt unable to bomb Kyiv. There were no air raid sirens for 24 hours because of the 15 of us from 15 different countries who'd come together. But even now, whether it's NATO or EU membership or arming, this dance, this hesitation is still inbuilt. How have we not learned that counterattack has to be swift? And I welcome that Rishi Sunak has announced that we're going to give more support to Ukraine in the next 3 months than we did the whole of the last year. But then that also takes me to the question of, well, I thought we were doing everything we could last year. I thought we were doing everything we could. So how are we suddenly able to give so much more in just 3 months? So I think it is a very difficult time. We know that Putin will use his mincemeat approach. We know that Ukrainian soldiers are struggling because they're facing Wagner soldiers high on drugs, attacking them in a zombie-like manner. And we know that the Ukrainians have an infinite number of people. So I do worry about it, but that is why we have to redouble our efforts now, and we can't be waiting until June or September or the next Rammstein. We all have to do what we can because they are fighting for us.
One of the really extraordinary things about this moment is we've got this very sort of deteriorating geopolitical environment with various different threats, land war in Europe and so on, but at a time of extremely constrained resources. How do you think this is affecting the choices that government is having to take around foreign policy?
So actually, I have to say, on defence and foreign policy, I haven't been very critical of the government in terms of their financial commitments because they've stepped up. And I think it's worrying that actually when I meet with international leaders, this dance of Britain giving things first to then essentially push others into doing so has now become accepted. If I was leading a foreign nation, I wouldn't want to know that the only way that I was expected to give anything was if Britain went first. I also really want to challenge this narrative that Britain has become a second-tier power. If you go into a meeting with any ambassador from a NATO member country, or if you go into a meeting with any foreign secretary of a NATO member country, they think it's risible that our media are so obsessed with the idea that Britain in decline. Post-Brexit, and I voted for Brexit, I was amazed that when I met with people, they genuinely believed that Britain was going to step back from our responsibilities to Europe and to European security. That had never even crossed my mind. In Ukraine, we have proven ourselves. After America, we are the foremost guarantor of European security, and we will continue to act and to support. And so I think it's really important that we don't allow people who want to somehow diminish Britain's place in the world to have that chance to say that. Because if you go into any meeting with any country around the world, they want Britain in the room. They want Britain around that negotiating table. They want us discussing defences. And when Britain convenes, the world comes and the world listens. So I find it really exhausting, this desire to talk down Britain and discuss that we are somehow not living up to our commitments. When in Ukraine, without question, we have proven that not to be the case.
I was very struck in your speech that you framed a sort of dichotomy between democracies and autocracies. It does feel as though these days we often don't talk about the word democracies. There's this sort of post-Fukuyama sensitivity that, that was very much of a time that we can no longer feel that there is inevitability about the march of democracies, and actually increasingly you hear the language of sort of free and open and not even a liberal world order, just a sort of stable world order. Why is it important for you to use that word democracy and to use that as the frame?
So I will cox and box and use it in different opportunities and different circumstances. So it wasn't until I worked in the Foreign Office that I understood that we don't need to sell democracy to every single country. It is not necessarily the right model for every single country around the world. They need to decide what is right for them and what is the right way that they wish to structure things. But at the same time, when I meet countries, particularly if you look at the Western Balkans, for example, the desire to be a thriving democracy, the desire to have the rights of people to have a say over their own country and their own futures, it is the strongest desire that they have. Again, in Ukraine, everywhere you go, they say, help us, we want to make this happen, we want to do it. So the fight is between the international rules-based system and autocracies. But so often than not, it is about democracy, and it is about the right to have a say. But I will qualify that I don't believe that this goal of the early 2000s of imposing democracy on countries, that is the only system that we should accept. That's deluded and absolutely wrong.
Okay. I'm about to go to the audience for questions and online, and I should say online as well. Put up your virtual hand if you would like to ask something, and we'll bring you in. But just one final question before we do. I was struck by the breadth of the issues that you mentioned in your speech. How are you taking decisions about what to prioritize for the committee this year? And how does that process take place? I'm interested in sort of where you look at what the government's doing and sort of try and work out where the gaps are and where you can be most useful in playing that constructive scrutinizing role.
So it is a real challenge because we have the whole world in front of us and there are so many geopolitical issues. But where I see select committees as pivotal for the ability of governments to govern. The role of Parliament is to challenge government. It is to give, particularly the Foreign Secretary, room to manoeuvre, for us to challenge ideas and push narratives and say things that he could never say, so that he has the ability when he goes into negotiations to say, you better give me something because that woman in Parliament, she is not going to stop. She's going to make sure she wins unless you give me something. But also to allow them to have the space for discussions they don't have. Select committees so often lead the way. So if you look at the Moscow Gold Report the Foreign Affairs Committee did a few years ago before I joined the committee, that if only all those recommendations had been brought in, we'd be in a stronger place now. When I joined the committee, the first thing I did in March 2020 was ask if we could visit Taiwan, because I was worried about it, and also Bosnia, Ukraine, and do an inquiry into multilaterals. And we did all of those. Taiwan, it took a bit long, we were delayed by a certain virus, but we got there in the end. But my goal is not for us just to look back and scrutinise, I want us to shape things. So the inquiries that we're currently doing, state hostage taking, because we should be very clear that autocrats are industrialising that as a form of geopolitics and as a form of foreign policy. The Wagner Group, I don't want us just to repeat what we already know about Wagner. I want this information we publish to change the public understanding and to put forward meaningful proposals for what the government can do to improve their approach to it. Critical minerals, as I touched on, when I first put that forward to the committee back in October, I'm not sure everyone was fully on board. But now, luckily, everyone is. We all vote, we all discuss, so it's not the chair imposing what they want to do. And then Central Asia, because as we see Russia receding slightly, as we see the strength of the Turkic organisations, as we see this battle for critical minerals, Central Asia is not somewhere you hear the government talking about. So I don't want us just looking back. There will be times where we solely scrutinise, looking backwards, so the Afghanistan inquiry and things like that. But I want us to push forward, put forward ideas, challenge where there are vacuums, and particularly where the government doesn't want to publicly talk about an area. The Balkans is another good example where when I went to Liz Truss and Boris Johnson back in 2020 and said I was really worried about the Balkans, I got blank faces in response. But as a result of Parliament, we have a sanctions regime now solely for Bosnia. We put sanctions on the leader of Republika Srpska, Dodik. We increased the number of troops on the ground. We got Balkans put on the agenda at the NATO ministerial. We have worked to change what is taking place and the international focus on it. But the other thing is that select committees, as I mentioned with the Moscow Gold Report, often put forward very meaningful policy ideas, and that's what you'll always see from me. I want solutions and ideas. But once the government has written a lovely report in response saying, thank you so much for your recommendations that took you months to work on, we're going to do 3, 7 and 9 and that's about it, and you're lucky that we're doing any of them. What I'm going to do is haul the government back in a year after every single one of our reports and say, which of our recommendations have you done? Prove that you have done them. And these ones, why didn't you? But also tell us which ones we were wrong about, having looked back. And I think the government isn't quite ready for that shift in select committees. We're also going to do spotlights. So when we're not doing an inquiry, for example, we did one 2 weeks ago on the EU's future relationship with the UK in terms of security and foreign policy agreements. We're going to do these spotlight one-offs that allow us to really react to what's happening at the moment. But I think that too often it is that looking back, and we need to be forward-leaning because we can bring meaningful ideas that shape our country.
Government on notice. Wonderful. So we'll go to the audience now. I'm going to boldly attempt to bring in 2 online questions, and we'll take 2 questions, one after the other. So we'll start with Oscar Janti. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing anyone's names. And then we'll go to Chris Brannigan. So we'll start with Oscar. Thank you.
Waiting for a voice or some text?
Waiting for a voice.
Oh.
That's okay.
Do you want me to take one in the room?
We'll take one in the room, and then we'll try our online audience again. Okay, Latika.
Hi, Alicia. Latika Burke from the Sydney Morning Herald. Just picking up on 2 points that you made. You wanted less rhetoric, more action. But how do you apply that to the states that are reluctant to take sides on Ukraine, and specifically G20 ones? So we saw what happened in Indonesia last year. The same looks to be about to repeat itself in India. Israel famously has still not chosen a side in Ukraine, despite Zelensky pleading so. But these are really critical relationships also for us. So what do you propose about how we balance that and have any meaningful impact in shaping their views?
So those are, all the countries you named are pretty critical partners for us as we go forward, particularly in Indo-Pacific. And one of the things that we're currently just finishing our Indo-Pacific inquiry as a committee, which is waiting for the IR refresh, as most people are in security and defence. India is a really interesting one, because I cannot tell you what our strategic priorities are for India. Where are we looking for India to support us? Where are we challenging India on certain things? I know we want a trade deal, but foreign policy is not just about trade. And so what I want to understand more and unpack with Indonesia as well is where we're having the positive relationship and where we're trying to embed that, where we're trying to grow that, and what are our objectives. But also, where are we challenging them? Because I think sometimes with foreign policy it's forgotten that it's not just about being friends with everyone around the world. It's about standing up for our red lines and making clear that we also expect things in return for friendship. And not for friendship, but for certain levels of cooperation. So I think we do need to be a bit more hard-nosed. And that's the thing. So that's why we're going to do these sessions. We did a one-off on India about 3 months ago now. But the reality is some countries will never be able to make a choice. We recognise that. If you look at Mongolia, it's a really interesting choice. They're between Russia and China. They're probably the most difficult geopolitical positioning of anywhere in the world. But they have had the bravery to abstain. Now, some people may not believe that abstaining is a sign of strength. But when all your electricity comes from Russia, and when all your oil comes from Russia, and when you sell all of your goods, something like 94% of them through China, for you to take a position of abstention is actually a position of strength. So what we need to understand is, where can India and Indonesia show strength? It's definitely not cutting off the Ukrainian speaker at exactly 13 minutes when you don't do the same to the Russians. We just need to recognise that. So I'm not saying that every single country has to come out and announce sanctions, but also we need to be stronger in calling out those who definitely are not looking at how they can support national sovereignty. Serbia, for example. Why are we running around after Serbia when they are the ones that have refused to join us on sanctions? Their MPs were in Moscow celebrating the 1-year anniversary of what took place, and we see enhanced and significant signs that ethno-territorialism is on the rise again. this proposal on Kosovo at the moment to create a Serb enclave. How have we not learnt from the 90s? I was a child. But how have we not learned that you do not entrench and give any room for ethno-territorialism? I think we've got a real challenge on our hands where we're not being strong enough on some who've clearly chosen a side, but we're pretending they haven't. And then with others, we need to scope out why they can't pick a side. And if so, we need to work out how we meaningfully help them to make sure they're not enabling, however, those who are committing appalling atrocities.
I'm going to try to bring in Chris Brannigan online. Chris, can you hear us?
Hi, Sophia. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Alicia, thank you for the presentation. My question really centres around, so I should introduce myself. I'm a senior fellow at Policy Exchange and formerly part of the number 10 policy unit. I was going to ask, how do you see the government meaningfully raising national awareness of our resilience and one would hope to therefore reduce our vulnerabilities without creating alarm amongst a population who are slightly deaf to most of what goes on? And perhaps as a supplementary to that, I might ask you, how do you think we would more effectively generate and incorporate greater involvement within our resilience projects?
So the government published its resilience, I think they changed it to being a framework rather than a strategy or a pathway or something along those lines. And it was pretty weak on community engagement and everything else like this. When I was working in the Foreign Office on how do we defeat Daesh, it was really interesting because David Cameron came back on the strategy that we'd written and said, well, where's the bit about keeping the UK public on side? And he was absolutely right, because it is absolutely right the public have a say in what we do in foreign policy and that they feel they have a voice, but also that we explain to them what we are doing. And this does go back to the early 2000s, and Blair, I believe, made a conscious decision to infantilise the public on foreign policy. You don't need to understand it, don't worry, we will keep you safe. That does not work, because when you do not have a public engaged in what is the greatest existential threat exists to them, whether or not they are safe and their loved ones, when you then need to engage with the public or certain parts of the public at a time of crisis, you can't do so without either making them feel that they are being seen through one lens, which is we think you're a threat and that's why we're currently talking to you, or disengagement at speed. So when we talk to the public about what's going to happen in Ukraine, the majority of the public thought that Russia pushed in, Ukraine needed some time to rebuild strength, and then Ukraine is slowly pushing them out, and that it is now a one-directional route where Ukraine is going to keep on pushing them out, and then there's going to be a lovely peace treaty at the end and it'll all be fine. That is not how war works, and our public are not ready for this conversation. But when I go to the Baltics, when I go to the Nordic countries, their contribution of the individual to national security is inbuilt. It isn't a conversation you need to have or start to have, because every single person recognises, and it may be because the history of occupation is so scarred within their national mentality, but they understand that every single person has a role to play. And the reality is, if we don't have a choice about whether or not we do this, because at the moment, every single day, at this exact moment while I'm speaking, there are battles taking place online without a single word being spoken aloud about what is the truth. And actually, whilst many people don't like this, that is what a lot of warfare and battles and conflict boils down to. What is the truth? Daesh believed that the truth was that everyone should live under a caliphate and that their way of life was right and that's how it should happen. Putin, I'm not even going to repeat his appalling narrative about what was happening in Ukraine and who was running Ukraine. The battle is over truth. And the reality is these conversations are taking place, unfortunately, now more online. They are offline. And when you choose to share content that is disinformation, you are enabling those who are seeking to undermine us. And disinformation is part of every single part of warfare, and it is separate to cyber. And I do worry that when I speak to some people sometimes in government and beyond, they think that information warfare is somehow new. It's not. And it is also separate to cyber. We don't have a choice, and it does start with conversations in the classroom about critical thinking. If we can improve the quality of critical thinking in our country, we will be safer as a country. But also we do need to have a discussion about things like talking to our children about what they put online and what they don't put online and why it's a risk and why it's not a risk. We do not have enough of those conversations. And you know, I haven't sat down and yet written a booklet for how we do this. But that is what the government should be doing, and it should be investing the time in, because otherwise when you do want to speak to a marginalised community or a community where there is a potential risk of recruitment, there is no basis for that conversation with them, and they will solely see it as them being labelled at risk or likely being radicalised or recruited or hostile to the government, and then you can't have a conversation with them.
I completely agree with you on the struggles of the government to talk to the British people about foreign policy and national security, and something I do find that is especially crazy about it is that because of the historical strength of our institutions, both the British people, businesses and so on, really take signals and cues and listen to information from government. So we've been wasting that opportunity, but no more time to waste. So we'll go back to the audience now and take a couple more questions. I might take two together at once, just mindful of time. So the two gentlemen here on the inner of the aisle.
Hi, it's Adam Bailey from Iran International.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
You're still here?
Yes,
That's great.
Yeah. What was I going to ask? You're very forceful about urging the government to take moves against transnational aggression by the Islamic Republic, not least recently about us. Are they listening? What steps do you think will be taken?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, when is the report on the State Hostage Committee, state hostage taking, coming out?
And just the gentleman across here, and if everyone can continue the good work of introducing yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, Tim Stickings from the National. Actually, you've basically asked what I was just going to ask, the things you want done to the IRGC. Why haven't they happened yet? Are there splits in the government? What are you doing to persuade people on that?
So on our state hostage-taking inquiry, we are almost done. In the next few weeks, we'll publish some really difficult to read evidence from those who have been held hostage and their loved ones. But I'm hoping we will publish in March time, although I feel like I should be looking to my clerks because they're the ones who've got to do all the writing. So maybe April I'm being mouthed at. So we'll go for April. On what we do about Iran, so the first thing is, as I said, we need to shut down their centres, their cutouts that are operating on our soil. So that's Maida Vale, Wilson and Manchester. They need to be closed immediately. On the IRGC, and I know politicians aren't meant to talk about the intricacies of discussions, but this isn't straightforward. I have called for the IRGC to be prescribed because I do think it's the right thing to do, but we do have to talk about what we're giving up to do that. Prescribing the IRGC will not make a meaningful difference for our government's ability to tackle the IRGC. That is the reality. But it is an important political sign that we would send, that we will not accept any more the activities of the IRGC on our soil and beyond. However, if we do that, the likelihood is that Tehran will make us leave Tehran. We will have to close our embassy. Now, to my mind, I question, and I've raised this publicly, the safety of our people in Tehran at the moment. I'm not convinced that they are safe, and I have friends who were in the embassy last time it was overrun, and their stories haunt me and stay with me as to what they endured when the Iranian government decided to run over our embassy. Closing our embassy means that all those people currently being held hostage by the Iranian government, potentially we lessen our ability to advocate for them. Now, I think that's highly unlikely because I know a lot of the work we do to protect those hostages and to try and get them home is actually done from King Charles Street in the centre of London. But as Foreign Secretary, you've got to assume that the Foreign Secretary will have to ring every single one of those families and say, we are doing something that will not necessarily meaningfully change our ability to tackle Iran. It is the right thing to do, but you may, or others may claim that our ability to protect hostages is diminished. Now, I don't think it is diminished, but you would have to make those phone calls. You would have to have that discussion. That is very difficult to do. So overall, I have come down and we should prescribe. We should bring our people back from Tehran because I don't think it's safe. And I'm confident, having done our hostage inquiry, that the ability to fight for those being held hostage would not be diminished. But you can understand why the Foreign Office still wants to be on the ground. Well, they want to be listening, to understand, to learn, to be able to understand what is going on in that country. But this is the problem with foreign policy. When we talk about talking to the public, it is not so simple as prescribe or don't, right, wrong. There are things you have to trade-offs and difficult decisions you have to make. But that is where I've come down on it, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily that straightforward. I do think the government meaningfully wants to take action to protect us, and I hope that you feel they're taking meaningful action to protect you and your people, and thank you for being a voice, as I said, for those who Tehran's trying to silence. But there is nothing simple when it comes to Iran. And what we should be doing is strategically working out how do we sow a divide between Russia and Iran, for example. How do we restrict Iran's most heinous actions that they are taking, whether it's attacking Kurdish communities, whether it's enabling in Iraq, well, what they are doing in Syria. There are many things that we should be looking at beyond that. But I can see why, and ultimately why I came down to the decision that we should prescribe. But it's not a straightforward decision.
Go back to the audience again. The lady there with her fourth row back. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. Katie Mapp from the Tony Blair Institute. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the role of UK soft power, specifically overseas with things like the BBC World Service, British Council and so on, and how you think these institutions and kind of more traditional forms of like truth-telling abroad can help in this kind of information battle you've been talking about. Thank you.
So I think those institutions, I don't think there's any disputing within Parliament that those are incredibly important, that British soft power is key. Often when you are trying to undertake interventions either to bring a country more on side or to engage better with communities, it is through soft power. But they are also being weaponised by the autocrats. And so when we talk about taking action to defend ourselves, it is those soft power institutions that hostile self-governments first threaten to close. And so we have to be very clear-eyed, and there is a difficult balance to be struck between where actually we are letting autocrats bully us into not acting against them because we don't want these closed, and where actually we should be closing them because actually the cost of inaction against that autocrat is too great. But these are incredibly important tools, and I think when you are in the Foreign Office holding negotiations, there is no question those institutions play a vital role in winning people over to what we need and what we are trying to achieve.
Do you think in this environment of constrained resources that the government has taken a decision to prioritise hard power over soft power?
I don't think so. That's not what I've drawn as a reflection as yet, but I have to say it isn't an issue that I've specifically sat down and spent a lot of time considering. But the reality is, with the rise of autocrats, it is the time for hard power.
Wonderful. Okay. Sam.
Hi, Sam Hogg. I write Beijing to Britain, which looks at how the
Never
UK,
heard of it.
thank you very much, discusses China. I'm keen to sort of know from the point of view of the Foreign Affairs Committee chair where you think some of the hold-ups or blocks are from a Whitehall perspective around the discussion around China.
The main hold-up is lack of China capability. We have people, civil servants across tens of departments who have China in their title or where it is a core part of their daily job. But these people are never brought together. One of the only times they're ever brought together is actually when, for example, the Great British China Centre does an education 2-day conference to try and upskill people in Chinese capabilities. We need to be bringing people together at all levels of government, not just Director Generals, I'm sorry they won't want to hear that, but people at all levels to talk about how the different work they do is intersecting. I think a lot of it is also fear. But the main thing comes back to capability. If we understand better the country that we are dealing with, we'll be more effective at bringing forward proposals. But there is a reality that within the civil service, often the best ideas are stopped early on because it's about managing your ministers. It's not about getting the best possible policy. It's about making sure your minister doesn't go too far off-piste. So we're only going to give them these two options, because if we give them these two other options, well, that might then give them some ideas, and they might go running this way and that way, and that way we won't be able to control them. We need to make sure that more policy making brings ministers into the discussion. But it all goes back to capability, I think, and then the fact that there is no meaningful China strategy across all departments, not in the way that we are talking about when we talk about China. When we talk about resilience, we talk about whole of state, recognising that all parts of government need to pull together. I mean, the fact that on the procurement bill, the first time I sat down with civil servants on this a year ago, the idea that national security was a key lens through which we should be seeing that bill was like I was talking, like I was talking a foreign language. National security is so key to everything we do, but we do almost leave it to the kind of geeky guys in the Foreign Office that want to go and do the high side stuff. We need to change our China capability. We need to do it urgently, and it's not just China. There's other concerns beyond that.
We're going to bravely try another online question from Edward Cheney from UCL. Please go ahead.
It's like waiting for God.
It is.
Waiting
for the omnipresent voice to enter the room.
Yes, sorry, I've unmuted. You mentioned a number of states you say threaten world peace. In a somewhat binary account of democracies and autocracies, I wonder what your recommended policy vis-à-vis the United States is. Some would argue has been more belligerent than any other.
So I have to say, when I have been at negotiations at the UN, or when I've been in meetings with our US counterparts, belligerence isn't what I have genuinely seen. The UK and the US do work incredibly closely together. I always say they bring the quantity and the money, and we bring the quality. And together it makes a very good partnership. But I am starting to see belligerence that worries me. And this takes me back to my point about Kosovo earlier. I'm very concerned about what we saw under the Trump regime when it came to the previous Kosovo government. I'm worried about this appalling proposal, as I mentioned earlier, that's being brought forward now. And there is a level, and I'm not in the room, so I don't know, but the narrative that I'm hearing coming out of France, Germany, and the US threatening, essentially, that if Kosovo does not sign up to this proposal, they will be locked out of the room, that this could destabilise the region. That is not the language I want to hear. And so I'm sure the French, German, and American ambassadors will be reaching out to me within a few hours to talk to me about this. But belligerence is not normally what I've seen. Do they command a confident position in negotiations? Of course they do. They're America. But we should be grateful for that. Because let's not forget that actually the conversation we should be having is not whether America's belligerent or not, but if Taiwan is evaded, we will all be very grateful that we know America will have to go and pivot and will lead the response there. But that then leaves a question for who's going to pick up in the Euro-Atlantic. And that actually falls to the UK. The UK will have to step up. And that will be when we seriously have to talk about financial consequences of what's going on the world stage. But for me, look, I've seen the Americans disagree and lose an argument at international discussions. I've seen them disagree and win an argument. But normally I found them to be fair, just, decent, and able to work with them entirely to achieve our objectives. That might be because our objectives are always aligned. But I think there is a sensitivity there. But as brothers, best friends, whatever you want to call them, I have never seen stronger disagreements between two countries than between Britain and the US, because we're able to have that, because we have the underlining structures of civil servants, intelligence, and military alliances that could never be undone. They could never be torn asunder. And that gives you amazing freedom to operate, argue, discuss. And actually that's what we want to see more of. We want to be able to have honest, open discussions and arguments with our allies to get to the right place.
I think we had, okay, so we've got a couple. What we might do, just mindful of time, is we'll take one final round of questions. So the lady at the front, and then the gentleman on the side there on the right. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Simona Liskor, Ambassador of Slovenia. Alicia, you spoke about the need to uphold the international order, the rules-based order, and to reform international organizations, multilateral organizations. So how, in your view, this reform, this change should take place? Should we expel some members? Should we ban them to put forward candidacies for different bodies, commissions, councils? So how this reform, in your view, should take place? And then on the reconstruction of Ukraine, if I may be more concrete, the conference that London will host in June, that will try to mobilize also private sector. So how do you see these funds for reconstruction of Ukraine? Where would these funds come from? We also have these Russian seized assets, so can we use that? Who will pay the biggest part? Maybe the European Union, some others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just very quickly, the gentleman here, if you can boldly project.
Yeah, hello, James Dickham from the Telegraph. The US is using export controls on technology as a sort of increasingly important part of its foreign policy toolkit and enlisting allies in the process as well. I'm wondering if you think there's scope for Britain to do more on that front, particularly semiconductors, companies such as ARM.
So we've got reform of institutions, Ukraine reconstruction, and the influence that Britain can have on US protectionist export control.
So I think on the reform of multilaterals, the first thing we have to do is change how we talk about multilaterals, because as I touched on in my speech, they are the results of their members. So when we want to blame multilaterals for not doing good enough or not achieving enough, we should be talking about ourselves. It's us that's failing to make them do what they should be doing. What I would do is refer everyone to our report that we wrote on multilaterals, where we set out clear proposals of what the government could be doing. But refusing to seek ground is a key point. I remember when I was at the UN peace talks on Syria again in Geneva, Lavrov tried to get me banned from the building. And the UN allowed him. They enabled him to try and ban a member of the British delegation from the building. And the only way I was managed to stop it was that it just so happened that 3 ambassadors and I would always go to this event every single day together. And I said, well, if you're throwing me out, are you also throwing out these other countries? And the UN went, oh no. And so the next day we came back and everyone had to be on a list to be allowed in the room. And obviously I wasn't on the list. The next day they put a physical lock on the door so they could control who did or didn't get into the room. Why is the UN doing a dance because Lavrov says that he finds it too distracting to have Alicia Kearns in the same room as him? Not because of my beauty, to be clear. That was absolutely not on the table. But apparently I was distracting him and I was a hostile force within the room. What are our multilaterals doing? We have to, but the report makes some really sensible, pragmatic proposals for what we can do. On reconstruction, it's really important we have this conversation. We cannot wait for Russia to be removed from Ukrainian territory to rebuild. Again, when we were fighting Daesh, we never liberated an area without a plan for how quickly we could switch back on the water, rebuild the roads, get the hospitals and schools going. It has to be the same now. It is amazing, having been to Irpin and Bucha, seeing how quickly they have rebuilt some areas. But on the point about Russian central bank and its funds, $350 billion have been frozen. They now need to be seized. I'm sorry, but the argument from the government and others are a straw man argument. The argument is that our property laws are too tough, or there's no legal framework for doing this, or we can't be sure of the legalities of doing it. I'm a legislator. Let me change the law. And if it needs to be tested in a court, let's test it in a court. I do not believe that sovereign immunity stands when you've committed a crime of aggression. It's not that complicated. And our voters around the world are not going to forgive us if we ask them to find the $350 billion that it's going to cost minimum to rebuild. And finally, on US, yes, the approach the US is taking. So there are a lot of policies where the US is ahead of us, but there are also some where I think it's more performative than necessarily something that's going to meaningfully change things. The CHIPS Act, for example, I'm not sold. I wouldn't want to see us repeating that here in the UK. But on export and import controls, I think there is a real conversation to be had there about what we can do. The Americans at the moment are far advanced in terms of where they want us to go with this, and I've met with the US to discuss specifically their proposals. But I think you will have to see movement from the UK on this as well.
Wonderful. Well, that's an excellent point for us to close. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but thank you very much to the audience for being here. Thank you to our online audience. Thank you to the wonderful team at PX who brought this together. And all that's left to do is ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful speaker, Alicia Kearns. Thank you very much.